We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make Cap Times Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and EPIC. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.
Cap Times, and welcome to Cap Times Idea Fest. We're really glad to have you here, and I hope you'll be looking forward to a days full of sessions, including this one about what will happen in Wisconsin's 2022 statewide elections. I'm going to turn this over to our moderator, Jessie Opoien, in just a moment, but I'd like to take a little bit to thank our sponsors. First of all, that's the Burrish Group at UBS, which is our presenting sponsor for the fourth consecutive year. An event of this magnitude wouldn't be possible without their support. Other major sponsors are Quartz Insurance, HealthX Ventures, and Exact Sciences. Other sponsors include Madison Gas and Electric, EPIC, Godfrey & Kahn, Doc Smokehouse, which is catering tonight's reception, Madison Community Foundation, Cargo Coffee, University Research Park, Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, and Forward Theater. Our media partners are WKOW Television Channel 27, the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, and Hinckley Productions, which is doing the digital production of Idea Fest. And my thanks to all of you for being here. We really appreciate it. If you're looking for further ways to support the Cap Times, I hope you'll consider becoming a member. You can find out information at membership.captimes.com. One final bit of housekeeping before we get started. You're welcome to submit questions to the panelists during the morning's talk, but we ask that you do it using note cards that our volunteers have here, and they'll take those up to Jessie to work in as time permits. So, without further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Jessie, who covers state government for us and is our Capitol Bureau Chief at the Cap Times. Her work has been honored by the Milwaukee Press Club and the Wisconsin Newspaper Association. She also writes our biweekly Capitol Notes newsletter. Please give her a warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here bright and early on a Saturday. I know there's lots of things you could be doing, so we're glad you're here. Since we've got our masks on, if we're in a small enough room, if you're having problems hearing us or anything, just shout out, let us know. We'll do our best to enunciate through the masks. Looking forward to discussing the upcoming elections with this great group of panelists. We've got Angela Lang, Executive Director of Block, Dan Balz with the Washington Post, and Andrew Hitt, the former Executive Director of the Wisconsin Republican Party. Thank you guys for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
So to kick things off, Dan, you're the sort of outside observer here, but you're very familiar with Wisconsin. Wondering if you could kind of talk about, as you look at the different states that you cover and the landscapes that you see, what stands out about Wisconsin to you?
Well, thanks for having me here this fall. It's great to be here. Thank you all for coming out at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning. It's good to be here with Andrew, who I've been on phone conversations with over the summer, but never met face to face, and Angela similarly. So it's nice to be here. I mean, the thing that stands out to me about Wisconsin is I don't think that there is a state in the country that has been as politically divided over so many elections over so many years as this state. I mean, obviously there are a lot of other states that play a prominent role in national politics. There are other states that have had some very contested elections and some very close elections. But really, I think since the election of 2010, Wisconsin's been in a unique position. And as somebody told me over the summer, Wisconsin has been kind of the canary in the coal mine for what we have now seen, all across the country and certainly in Washington. And I think that when you look at Wisconsin I mean, one of the things I say about it, people say, well, it's kind of a purple state, or it, leans a little blue or a little red. I think it's two states. I think it's a blue state with the blue enclaves and a red state through most of the rest of the state. And I think that political culture has embedded itself over the last decade in a way that is now, if not permanent, semi-permanent. And one of the big questions to me is what 2022 will mean in terms of moving the state in one direction or another, or keeping it kind of in this, this kind of frozen status in which the two sides are very much at one another's throats. If you look at the two premier races in this state, the gubernatorial race and the Senate race, both of them have enormous implications, both for state politics and for national politics. Obviously, depending on whether Senator Johnson runs again or not, that seat it could be the pivotal seat or a pivotal seat in determining whether Democrats retain control of the Senate or whether Republicans pick up control, in which case that would have huge implications for President Biden's second 2 years in office. The gubernatorial race here, is going to decide whether Republicans can regain full control of the levers of power here, or whether there will continue to be a check and balance, which we've seen for the last 2 years, and the kind of political battling that has gone on. So I think the eyes of the country will continue to be on Wisconsin heading into next year.
Gridlock is we're no stranger to it at this point. We're pretty much used to it. It's the status quo. But I mean, there was a time in Wisconsin when you could have divided government and things did get done. There was negotiation, discussion across the aisle. Do you guys think those days will ever come back?
I think we got to be hopeful that they will. I think, because I have the exact same analysis when I talk to friends and people are like, what is happening? And I do think a lot of it started with 2010. No matter what side you're on, I think there used to be this Midwest nice of, we don't agree, but let's grab a beer and we can talk later. There isn't much of that anymore. And quite frankly, I think it's sad. And I think it alienates people, and it's further making us more and more polarized. But as someone that clearly has not worked that long in politics, because I'm still hopeful these days, but I feel like we have to be, right? I've never lived in a different state. I choose to call Wisconsin home, and I hope that one day that we can do that. But honestly, I do think it's going to be a tough few years ahead as we continue to kind of reconcile all the challenges that we're facing, and what does it look like to unite as a country? Can President Biden unite us? That's, I think, still a question that is looking to be answered too. But I got to be hopeful, because if I don't have that, then I don't have much at all.
and I would say I do think there is more of that discussion able to go on behind closed doors,
Sure,
privately.
yep.
But now that we're in this sort of age of social media, 24/7 news coverage, there's just a lot of positioning that seems to always be going on with people, with elected officials. It's that positioning that I think portrays this nobody gets along, everybody's always fighting. I think behind the scenes there is a little bit more discussion going on. We need to see more of that come out, and probably less of the positioning so much on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, makes sense.
Any of you can weigh in on this, just sort of handicapping the election going into 2022 right now. What are the biggest advantages and liabilities for the two parties?
Sure, I'll go.
Andrew, why don't you start on that?
I think the biggest liabilities for Democrats really is that Governor Evers, he hasn't racked up a list of accomplishments, and part of that is divided government, but part of that is whether or not you can work through the divided government, and he has not been able to. So I think you have the power of incumbency. Incumbency, though, the power of that is racking up those accomplishments. It's getting around the state and doing all of those things that you can do, with your bully pulpit. Because of COVID and how and even more recently, and how he's, kind of reacted to COVID, I think he doesn't have those two incumbency advantages that others have in the past. Republicans, we certainly do have some challenges. We're going to have, potentially multiple primaries, although that seems to be certainly dwindling on the gubernatorial race. I think that one is looking more like almost the 5th congressional district when Jim Sensenbrenner was replaced. We thought, I was chairman at the time. We thought it was going to be a 10-person primary, and it really went down to 2. This is dwindling more and more as kind of former Lieutenant Governor Clayfish, just continues to do so much early work and sort of has done everything right in the lead up to it.
Yeah, I think when it comes to the governor's ability to get work done, it's a challenge, right? Like Wisconsin is such a polarized state, and we see that play out in the political dynamics. I think sometimes people feel that the governor is a goalie at this point, just trying to stop harmful policies or what people feel as harmful policies. But I think also people are looking for more proactive solutions, but that's difficult given how things are set up. I think for liabilities for both parties is there's different factions on both sides. You have the more moderate Democrats versus the progressives. You have the Mitt Romney Republicans versus like a QAnon Republican, right? And so I'm really curious to see how those voters play out, what that looks like, considering we don't have a lot of a middle ground. And so, how are these factions going to be playing out? But I think ultimately, going back to getting out early, I think everyone knows it's about getting out early. It's about talking to as many people as possible. And everyone's trying to figure out how to do that in this era of COVID. You can't have the big giant rallies and feel like you're being responsible in the pandemic these days. So I think people need to get creative, but I think ultimately people need to make sure that the candidates are talking to them. We need to make sure that we're talking to as many people as possible, no matter what kind of fissures and factions on both sides that both parties have to deal with.
I guess what I would say is, if starting with the Senate race, if you look at the number of Democrats who are in the primary, you would have to say they have concluded that Senator Johnson is quite vulnerable. In the Cook Political Report, now known as the Cook Political Report with Amy Walter, because she's taken it over from Charlie, Ron Johnson is the only incumbent in either party who is listed in the toss-up category. And so that gives you a sense of how vulnerable he is. The most interesting question, as I've talked to people out here over the last few months, is whether the Republicans are better off if Johnson runs for a 3rd term, which would break the pledge that he made that he would only serve 2, or would they be better off if he decides not to run and you get a fresh candidate? And you get mixed opinion on that. I think one thing that's probably reality is that Democrats run the risk of underestimating Johnson's appeal in this state. They underestimated him the first time he ran. They underestimated him the second time he ran, and they're in danger of doing that again. Having said that, Ron Johnson today is a different Ron Johnson than he was when he first got elected, and I think that's going to be the focal point of that race. I'll leave it to others to handicap the Democratic primary, but there's obviously a lot of choices that Democratic voters are going to have when they go to the polls next August in that primary. In the gubernatorial race, I think one advantage that the governor has is that he's an incumbent. And he is able at this point to get out and raise a lot of money and put together the kind of campaign apparatus that you need. There is always an advantage, or almost always an advantage, to being an incumbent. And this state does have a history of re-electing governors, sometimes multiple times. If you go back to Governor Thompson, 4 times. The flip side of that is somebody, I don't know whether, Andrew, it was you or somebody else pointed this out to me. Tommy Thompson is the last governor of Wisconsin to be elected with the president of his party in office. And so if Evers were to be reelected, he's running against that history. Those kinds of historical analogies may or may not mean anything, but nonetheless, that's the case. I agree with Andrew that the former lieutenant governor has certainly put herself in a position to be the nominee and potentially a strong candidate. I would think that that's going to be a very, very competitive race and in both races, tons of outside money coming into this state. So,
And as we discussed a little bit, there's no question that the two parties have moved further and further to either kind of extreme side, for lack of a better word, farther away from the center. So we're in the primary stage right now, and you've got to do one thing in a primary campaign. You've got to appeal to your base. You've got to turn out voters within your party. Then you have to go pivot into a general election, and you're talking to a whole different set of people. Is that harder to do in this environment than it may have been a few elections ago?
Honestly, I think it's always hard because our primary is so late. That's always been a thing, is that the primary is in August and you have to quick pivot very quickly before November, and people have to figure out resources and whatnot. But I also think in this climate, it's difficult. And I think we saw that a little bit play out in President Biden's campaign. Was he gonna just, be the moderate and go all the way through? There was some messaging of we just got to get him elected and then he can do the progressive things, or he's saying this now, but he's gonna, be the AOC when elected. And so I think sometimes people are trying to figure out who the real person is, what that real agenda is, because you have to be strategic, and you have to, I think, even be more so strategic in a state like Wisconsin, where it sometimes feels that you have to have two very different type of messaging, whether it's the rural messaging or the urban messaging. And so I think a lot of times primaries, you can get into that nuance, but then very, very quickly, a poised candidate needs to switch and be able to appeal to a candidate that to the candidate's base that they were opposing, just a few months earlier. And I think that can be difficult, again, going back to the different factions as well. And I think we saw some of that play out in the presidential primary and who was there. And then Joe Biden ended up being the more reasonable, quote unquote, candidate.
I think too, in some ways that pivot that has to occur, largely who's going to be more successful at it kind of turns into a landscape question and an issues question.
So I think to finish the thought, if those issues of public safety, of jobs, of getting kids in seats in schools are the issues that are really at the forefront, I think that pivot's going to be easier for a Republican, and they will be able to be on offense more, and it'll be more of a defensive issues that the Democrat has to deal with, or Tony Evers has to deal with, whoever the Democrat nominee is for the U.S. Senate.
I would argue there's a choice there, though, right? I think it could be a difficult pivot for Democrats, but it doesn't have to be, right? Democrats can be proactive in some of these issues. It's not a secret that my organization has been a little bit disappointed in the governor around criminal justice, but it doesn't have to be that way. I think there's enough time to fix that.
Yeah, good point.
one thing I would say about the Republican Party is that there is tension, obviously, between kind of the Trump loyalists and Republicans who are not so enamored of Trump. Kind of threading that needle or walking that line can be challenging, I think, for a Republican candidate. As somebody described to me, you have to do enough to show that, the Trump loyalists that you're not hostile to them or to Trump. At the same time, you've got to find a way to keep enough distance so you can appeal to, conservative Republicans who were turned off by Trump and, the three swing voters still left in America that they counted in this election. One of the things that I think we saw in the California recall, which affects, I think, all elections these days, is that mobilizing your base still is, or today is, the most important thing you can do. That, as one of the people who worked with Governor Newsom on the recall said to me, we realize that persuasion is not persuasion in the traditional sense, which is persuasion around a particular issue, or persuasion that that your candidate is the candidate who has the leadership qualities that you're looking for, but persuasion to get people to vote, and that's an essential part of it. So those are some of the trade-offs that I think both parties are going to have to deal with. Both candidates or candidates for both parties will have to deal with.
Well, in the 2020 election, if you look at the incumbent congressional Republicans, the incumbents, all of them outperformed President Trump. In total, tens of thousands of votes. President Trump would have quite easily won Wisconsin had everybody who voted for those incumbent Republicans in Congress, voted for their congressman, also voted for President Trump. If we go back to 2018, Governor Walker lost by about 30,000. In that cycle, we had 145,000 Republicans, or people who voted for Donald J. Trump in 2016 and didn't come out and vote for Governor Walker in 2018. 145,000, Governor Walker lost by 30,000. So Dan has a really good point. The Republicans have to find a way to motivate those rural voters who came out in droves for President Trump, but get back those suburbanites and make inroads then in Milwaukee and the Black and Hispanic community.
I'm going to take a couple audience questions. Given the unknown path of COVID, how does each party make a decision about which issues to promote?
That's a good question. I think I think there's like two ways to answer this. One, there's like the grassroots organizations and trying to insert issues into the campaign, and then there's obviously the candidates and the party themselves. I think any good candidate and party, it starts by listening to people instead of just saying these are the issues, right? You want to actually run on the issues people care about because it makes your life a lot easier instead of running about issues that people may not be caring about at that time. And so I think I am skeptical of polling and research these days for lots of reasons. I think lots of us are. But, what does it look like to be able to have conversations with voters or people that can't vote but, live here and still have issues that they care about? And so ideally, I would hope that people, candidates are doing their due diligence of listening to constituents now and really prioritizing their issues when it comes to election season, because ultimately that tactic will make everyone's lives easier if you're actually running on the things that people care about.
I think it's also because in southeast Wisconsin, rural part, stopped to get gas, nobody was wearing a mask. Nobody. Inside, people at the pump, the guy at the register, nothing. Drove down the street, literally 3 blocks away, everybody was wearing a mask. At the pump, person inside, people shopping. I couldn't explain it. I mean, it is not a purely partisan thing. It isn't. I traveled too much and saw too much. And so that, I think, is the big challenge to be able to navigate, is there are such differing views around this state. And you can't just say it's, this part of the state is this way, this part of the state is that way.
I think another aspect of the COVID and the elections is the path of this pandemic has been fairly unpredictable. If we were sitting here 3 months ago, we would have a different view of the state of the pandemic and the state of our own lives. And we would judge the people in power one way. Today, we're in a different place because of the Delta variant. There's much more concern. Everybody wants to be through this, and everybody knows that you can't be through it. But we don't know where it's going to be, 6 months from now or a year from now as we're heading into the election. The one thing that is reality in any midterm election is it's going to be the overall state and mood of the country that's going to affect every election. It's going to affect certainly the Senate and House elections, but it will also affect the gubernatorial election, as it did in 2018. 2018 was a really good Democratic year, and Governor Evers barely won that election against obviously a very strong incumbent in Governor Walker. So knowing what those issues are going to be, people, Andrew was right, you've got to have a sense from people, from voters, what's really on their minds. But we know that so much of it is going to be a kind of a broad judgment on President Biden and the stewardship that he has provided the country.
Let's talk about just confidence in our electoral system. You and I have talked about this a little bit, Andrew. I don't think this is a one side of the aisle issue. After 2016, we had a recount here in Wisconsin with Jill Stein. 2020, we're continuing to investigate, litigate, whatever, all of the above. What happened here in Wisconsin and what happened, throughout the country. How do those kind of ongoing conversations and concerns affect the way people campaign and the way voters are actually motivated at this point to participate?
I think the thing that I think is most concerning for me is when you talk to everyday people and you get outside of sort of the insiders and the people who do this and the news, all of us who do this all the time. Talk to everyday people, no matter sort of kind of where they're at on the political spectrum, there are people that are sort of, they've said to me, like, my vote count, like, is this even worth it anymore? And that's scary. I mean, that's not a good thing. We need to restore confidence. And I think, Jesse, you make a really good point, because we can think that this is only a 2020 issue, but just remember back to 2016, there were a lot of people, in Hillary Clinton's camp that were questioning the legitimacy of the election and Russian interference. And so this has been kind of going on for a while. And so I think what everybody needs to do, both sides, we need to try to figure out, and it's extremely difficult, how we restore confidence so that everyday people who are just around the state, wherever they are, whether it's Milwaukee or, Shawano County, all are saying, yeah, my vote counts.
And I hear that very often. Again, even pre-2020, pre-2016, it's just always different in like the framing of it. At first, it's just like, oh, my vote doesn't matter. I'm just one person. It's like the powerful elite, whatever it is. And so we used to hear that all the time on doors of like, oh, my vote doesn't matter. It's just one single person. And you're still hearing some of that sentiment, but you're hearing maybe some talking points from, the news or whatever. And I think ultimately, if for this democracy to work, we need to make sure that people have trust in the process, in the system. And we have systems in place. We have checks and balances in place. Recounts, that's within people's rights. And I think if people want to go through whatever process, that is completely within their right. But at the same time, you can't litigate yourself into a win if you lost. You know what I mean? And I think sometimes we're seeing a little bit of an overkill in that. And so I do think it's important to make sure that we have those checks and balances in place. If, whatever the rules are within a certain margin, you want to ask for a recount, that is well within your right. But you also have to understand when the process plays out, it may not work in your favor, and that is what it is. But that doesn't mean you have to continue to try and litigate and try to, maybe have some of these frivolous or sham type of investigations that aren't leading anywhere and are really not helping and trying to get people to turn out more if they don't feel that their votes are mattering.
There's an important difference, I think, between what we saw after 2016 and what we've seen after 2020. And that is, you have a former president of the United States who continues to press on the idea that this was a stolen election or a rigged election. That has amped up the concerns on the part of a lot of President Trump's followers, and it is creating, it is undermining what faith there was in the political system. Look, we know that elections are, they're not perfect. They're run by human beings. They're highly decentralized. They're not given to conspiracy theories in the way machines work or ballots are counted. Are there occasional mistakes? Yes, but not on the scale that the former president is trying to claim. And I think that as long as he continues to inject himself, which he's doing, I mean, he's chastised the Republican leadership in the state for not being more aggressive about doing the kind of thing that they're doing in Arizona, which is as controversial an audit or whatever you want to call it that has gone on in the country. So I don't know how we pull back from that if you have the person who is the leader of one of the parties continuing to try to do that. I think that's the real challenge right now. And I agree, we have to get back to a point where people have confidence in that system, but right now it's going to be very difficult to do so.
Take an audience question and maybe expand that a little bit. Will Governor Evers benefit from voters seeing damage being done to Florida and Texas by their Republican governors? Kind of broadening that, what is the national impact? Are people, voters, really paying attention to other states? Does that influence anyone's chances here?
I mean, I think if those other states reflect kind of the national landscape, like Dan was saying, and that is sort of the issues that are sort of nationally driving the news or driving candidates and driving President Biden, then I think it can. I think absent that, unique fights in a specific state are really unlikely to sway people who don't spend all of their time watching news. If it's kind of your swing voter, your moderate, or just people who have lives other than 24/7 TV news, then I think it's less.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I think, again, if we're outside of our bubble and you talk to average people, people may hear talking points. They may, hear some snippets on the news in between jobs and cooking and providing and whatever with their kids these days. I think at the end of the day, people know the issues that directly impact them, right? And so whether it's something very personal to them is going to be something that's moving, or if there are people, if they have family in other states, maybe that may play a role and a factor in it. But I think largely people are trying to make sure that their communities are safe in whatever way looks to them. People want to make sure that kids get the best education, whether that's in school or in virtual learning. So I think people are really focused on very intimate, real issues because there's so many real challenges that I think people are trying to navigate in real time. I don't want to say people aren't caring or don't have time to care, but it's like if you're worried about trying to provide for your family, you're not really thinking about the national political trends that maybe some of us are.
I think this notion is relevant right now because of what happened in California in the recall. Because in that case, Governor Newsom made an explicit contrast between what the governors of Texas and Florida were doing as opposed to what he was doing. He's been quite aggressive on vaccine and mask mandates for certain parts of the population, in contrast to what Governors Abbott and DeSantis have done. I think that worked in California because the biggest issue that he had to deal with was this kind of Democratic base that wasn't paying much attention to the recall in the middle of the summer and into early August, and he needed to do something to kind of galvanize that base. I don't know whether that is going to work in other states in other elections in a year from now. I think that's a big question mark around that. It worked in California, but California is such a blue state that all he had to do was just activate those Democratic voters. In a state like Wisconsin or other states that are much more divided, more closely divided, I don't know if that's going to be effective.
So barring any major surprises, I think we have a pretty good idea of what the governor's race might look like here. Seems very likely it'll be an Evers versus Clinton race. Senate race is completely up in the air. I know none of us can get inside Ron Johnson's head and know what he's thinking. It's going to be up to him to tell us what that is.
Andrew can tell us.
Yeah, I can tell you, I'm nearly 100% confident he does not know. And I'll even put it in sort of Senator Johnson terminology. Look. I mean, he honestly loathes the idea of running. He does not. It's not something he's like, yes, I want to do this. On the other hand, he will tell you that he's more concerned now about the direction of the country than he was in 2010 when he ran the first time. And that's the struggle that he is going through and trying to decide. And I also think, Senator Johnson, his experience is, he got in end of April, early May of the general election, that election year. And so he looks at it and says, I think I can wait until February and make a decision. And I think the people who are most upset about that are the candidates who want to get in and the political consultants who want to get paid by these candidates. Everybody else, I think, is like, okay. Can we predict any sort of effective, this really active Democratic primary going on sort of while this is stewing in the background?
I think I think it's kind of happening, right? Because people don't know. I think with Senator Johnson, people are hearing some of his comments, and it's like, okay, is he saying these things because he's gearing up to run again, or is he saying these things because he has nothing to lose because he's on his way out? And I think a lot of folks can't figure that out. Meanwhile, Democrats can't wait because people have to try and figure out how to inject their conversations into the mainstream narrative and make their own cases to voters as well. I am a fan of primaries. I think primaries are healthy. I think it's a way to galvanize your base. I think it's a healthy, robust discussion. I think none of us take elections lightly, and I think being able to have a robust primary helps in that, because I think it allows for a lot of diversity of opinions and thoughts and people to really kind of dig into that nuance before, it's like a party versus party type of conversation. But we also know that can be very difficult. And after a primary, people may not be ready to support the nominee. We saw that with kind of the Hillary Bernie type of deal, right? So that's, I think, a huge concern is like, how do you not, that's always the problem and the challenge with primaries. How do you not eat your own while that's happening. But also you have to do what you can to stand out and to make your case and to really dig into those nuances. And I think the candidates that we've seen so far, I hope we're done, knock on wood, with those candidates. But the candidates that we have in the race, there is a very diverse array of opinions, issues, lived experiences. And so I'm looking forward to seeing how all that plays out in a larger conversation.
Another audience question. I guess we could ask this about 100 different issues, but since it's kind of what we're focused on lately, what role will abortion play in the 2022 election? It seems like it's on top of mind right now, at least.
I mean, it is. It'll be interesting to see if this is a primary question and issue, or does it become a general election issue? I think if it's a primary issue, it's about energizing your base, energizing your supporters on both sides. If it becomes a general election issue, then I think it's more to navigate, again, for both sides. You look at Democrats who've been struggling in rural areas of Wisconsin, probably more likely to be there pro-life. Is there room for those moderate Democrats in a pro-choice, only Democrat Party? So I think it really comes down to when is this issue front and center, and does it drive in the general election?
Yeah, I mean, if the Texas law had been passed, not when it was, but a year from then you would say that's going to galvanize Democratic voters because it would be, the front and center issue. Great alarms about the threat to Roe v. Wade. Having passed when it did, we've got a long way to go to have other issues come to the fore, to have things happen on that front. The abortion issue is always a subtext in most elections, but in terms of which side or either side is truly galvanized by it, that's harder to tell until you really get to that moment.
I'm going to add an asterisk to the comment I said before about people not caring about what's happening in other states. People are caring about what's happening in Texas, right? Because it could be abortion, it could be whatever issue, because people are wondering, is this going to happen in my state? So I think in that regard, people are paying attention to it because is what's happening in a different state going to directly impact them? And so I do think it could be an issue. And, sometimes when we see these types of things, there's like sweeping, copycat bills in different states. So I think this is the one time, depending on the issue, if we know that there could be a wave of similar type of policy, that people are paying attention to it. I do think it could be a challenge, right? Normally, it probably wouldn't come up in a Democratic primary because I think there would be certain assumptions made. But people are probably going to call people to task these days, and people are going to have to figure out how to navigate that just because it is so fresh on people's minds. If it wasn't fresh on people's minds now, I don't think it would be a primary issue. I think it would be a general election issue, and maybe not even one that would feel super salient because there wasn't like a direct thing to respond to.
We got a little indication of the potential general election impact of this, although this is a race that's going to happen in this November. The Virginia gubernatorial race is a very competitive race. Terry McAuliffe, who had been the governor, he can't serve consecutive terms in Virginia, so he's been out for 4 years. He's running again. He's running against a man named Glenn Youngkin, who is a private equity person, newcomer to politics. They did their first debate the other night, and there was a question asked of Youngkin: would you, if you were governor, would you sign? Wasn't asked about the Texas bill. It was, would you sign a bill that outlaws abortion at the time of a fetal heartbeat? His answer was, I would not have signed the Texas bill. But he kind of fudged on signing something that would be closer to, the Mississippi law that's headed to the Supreme Court. That creates some difficulty for a Republican candidate in a swing state in a general election. The primary politics of this, as you guys say, are different. But in a general election context, if that comes to the fore and those issues are important, that's going to create some tension.
Operating under the notion that, as you put it, Wisconsin is not necessarily purple, it's a red state and a blue state arranged in some weird puzzle pieces. For each of the parties,
where are you targeting? Where are you looking to drive up the base? Where are you looking to reach new voters? And how do you do that in this ongoing weird Delta lingering era?
It's difficult. I think that's the thing. Something that we always say is you have to meet people where they're at, and you have to do that even more so in the era of COVID. And meeting people where they're at may be in a virtual sense, it may be on a phone. There are times where this is a door knock these days, right? Even though everyone's getting inundated with text messages. So I think it's a challenge. For us, specifically at Block, we're very much focused on turning out the Black community. So we're primarily focused in Milwaukee, and we've expanded to Racine and Kenosha, which I assume Kenosha is going to be a hot button issue. We're already starting to see it play out already. And so I think broadly, both parties, I think, understand that communities of color can make or break and be the difference maker. We've seen the Republican office opened an office on the north side of Milwaukee for the first time, I think it was ever, in 2020, right? And there's a new office being opened on the south side targeting Latinx folks. And so I think people understand both sides that the importance of communities of color and how much power and political power, when organized, can really be the margin of error in some elections. And so, a quick fact that we gave out is that in 2018, we knocked on over 227,000 doors and we had 20,000 contacts, and the governor won by 30,000 votes, right? Not saying that, we got 20,000 of them, trying not to make that assumption, but just to know how many doors that, grassroots organizations, parties knock on, all of that makes a difference. And I think it really comes down to communities of color. I think Kenosha is going to be a huge hot button issue, and people are going to try and figure out how to organize those communities, given everything that's happened in Kenosha the last year and a half.
I completely agree. I mean, Republicans ask me, all the time, how to begin statewide again. The first two are, getting those rural voters out so we don't have those disengagers, getting the suburban voters back. But, that is just a part of it. If you want to win statewide as a Republican, you have got to make inroads in the Black and the Hispanic community, which is something we've done a terrible, terrible job at over the years. And so I think finally, people are really in the Republican Party realizing it and really taking it to heart. And this last cycle, we did a lot of work out of that office on MLK and North, and really kind of doubled down on it this cycle by opening up office focused in the Hispanic community.
So which party do you think owns the enthusiasm edge at this point? Which party owns the enthusiasm edge at this point?
I would say Democrats, just because we have the competitive primary. I think if we didn't have such a competitive primary and it was just, for the Senate race, I think because people are paying attention to that, there is an enthusiasm there. I'm curious to see what the enthusiasm looks like in the general, right? Again, going back to those comments of if people don't get their candidate, are they gonna still be enthusiastic? I think there was even in the presidential, there was a little bit of an enthusiasm gap after President Biden got the nomination. Not everybody was supportive, and so sometimes it may take a minute to kind of catch up some of that enthusiasm. But I think right now, just because we have a lot of contested races and specifically the Senate, people are paying attention to, and like I said, there's fairly many candidates, but there's also covering a diverse array of topics. So I think just because of that, there's more energy, I think, on the Democratic side right now.
I think both bases are really highly energized. Republicans are energized about school, about local elections, about COVID, about, kids in seats. And so there's a lot of energy on the Republican side to unseat Governor Evers. And you can feel it, it's palpable. So I think both bases are energized pretty substantially for being so early in the cycle. I think, swing voters, independents, and sort of the people who aren't day in and day out base sort of folks, I think they're more, another election, does my vote count? Do we have to do this already? I don't think they're energized at all. And it's incumbent upon, I would say incumbent upon us as Republicans to make sure, a phrase I always use, meet people where they are, that you used it. I think that is the key. Meet people where they are, talk to them about issues that impact their lives and that they care about.
I think there are a couple of important questions about both parties and the energy that they have. For for Democrats, historically there's a fall off in midterm elections, which is greater than the Republican fall off, and that has to be a concern, and particularly for the first midterm election for a new president. That's always the most kind of perilous moment for a political party. We saw what happened to President Obama in 2010. He just took a terrible shellacking, and another one in 2014. I think the Democrats are energized, but there's a lot of sort of tension that's playing out in Washington over the Biden agenda. We don't know how this reconciliation package is going to end up. Joe Manchin threw a big monkey wrench into it the other day when he said that $3.5 trillion is way too much. We don't know what that actually means, but there's going to be some very tough negotiations about that. Will it jeopardize the bipartisan infrastructure bill? All of those are questions. Put that aside, Democratic Party is I wouldn't say split, but they are frustrated about the voting issues. They see what's happening in Republican states in terms of laws that are being passed on voting. They've got a national proposal. At this point, they have no way to get it through unless they change the filibuster rules. If they don't do that, if they're unable to do that, does that depress Democratic enthusiasm? It's quite possible that it could. I think for Republicans, the question that you and I have talked about, which is when Trump is not on the ballot, there is a fall off of real hardcore Trump voters. We saw that in 2018 nationally. We saw it here, as you pointed out. We could see that again in 2022. And the other factor is President Trump is being very active in a lot of primaries in the Republican Party. And depending on what kind of candidates come out of those, will part of the party be unhappy enough that they say, I'm going to stay home? So those are the big question marks that I have at this point as we watch these things play out.
I think we've got time for one more, so I'm just going to put out a pretty general one, which is what are the different moving parts that you're all watching for in the coming weeks, months, that you think will potentially shape the way this election turns out?
Well, it's fairly easy on the Republican side. It's what we sort of talked about. It's what does Ron Johnson do?
Yeah. that was my first thing to say. Like, what is he doing? That's the first one.
We've got Becky Clayfish, who's in for governor. We have Kevin Nicholson, who ran against Leah Buchmer in the primary, U.S. Senate primary on the Republican side, who pretty unconventionally has said he's running for either Gov or U.S. Senate, and seems to be, doing it kind of out of No Better Friend Corps, this organization he started. Just spent $1.5 million on an ad kind of introducing that organization. Is he in the Gov primary or is he in the U.S. Senate primary? If Ron Johnson steps out and Mike Gallagher gets in, that opens up a 8th congressional district seat. So there's a lot of dominoes that I think are going to fall pretty late in this process.
Yeah, I think that was the first thing I was going to say is, first of all, what is Ron Johnson doing? Because that's going to, I think, get a better handle on messaging and what really the landscape is. And then I also think people will start to question, okay, if he is or isn't, who is the best person on the Democratic side that is the most viable to beat him? I would also say I'm really curious to and really monitoring the governor at this point, right? The governor, he doesn't have the luxury of running against Scott Walker, which was a huge polarizing thing for a lot of folks in our community. He has to run on his own record. And there are times, given the divided government, people are like, well, what has he done? Again, going back to safety being an issue, safety means a lot of different things to many different people. And I think sometimes people are looking towards the governor to figure out, where does he stand on safety? Where does he stand in supporting communities of color, whether it's in Kenosha, Milwaukee, or all across the state? And so I'm curious to see how these kind of play out, because I think going back to what I said earlier, there is time for Democrats to be proactive on issues. The issues aren't set in stone. And so especially the governor, who has to prove his own track record, there is time for him to be proactive on some issues that people are kind of waiting to see for. I'm really curious to how safety continues to evolve and what safety means. I mean, it's something very different for all of us, but everyone wants to be safe. Everyone wants to make sure their families are safe, no matter what side of the aisle you're on. You just don't know how to get there. And our definitions are very, very different. But very curious to see how that continues to play out, how those narratives continue to play out, how Kenosha continues to play out, and I think also how this issue of schools right now is playing out, and by extension COVID, because we don't know what COVID's going to be like tomorrow. We don't know what it's going to be like next year. I think there was a moment where a bunch of folks on the Democratic side didn't think that we had to do a mail-in ballot strategy all over again, but maybe we do this time. And so I think some of how COVID is playing out and then the subsequent issues I think is going to be important too.
I'm looking at it obviously from a national perspective. I agree. I think that the issue of where COVID is, how it plays out, will be a potentially defining issue next year. I mean, it's been such a defining issue in our lives for almost 2 years now, and it continues to be. So that's one. And the second is really the state of the Biden presidency. He had a pretty good first 100 days. His second 100 days were a little more problematic, and as he gets now into the fall, he's got some real challenges on his hands. And he's kind of fighting on multiple fronts on a variety of issues. Whether he's going to be able to pull off all of the things he's talked about and how that affects enthusiasm on your side or your side, I think will be very telling. So that's kind of the way I'm approaching it at this point.
Well, thank you guys all for doing this. Thank you all for being flexible. I think we should do more of these outside.
Yeah.
We would like to take another moment to thank our sponsors, whose financial support helps make Cap Times Idea Fest the important event that it is. Special thanks to our presenting sponsor, UBS, the Burrish Group. They have been a major sponsor since the very first Idea Fest. Major sponsors include HealthX Ventures, Exact Sciences, and Quartz. Co-sponsors are Madison Gas and Electric, Godfrey & Kahn Law, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and EPIC. Our Friends of Idea Fest sponsors are Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, Madison Community Foundation, University Research Park, Cargo Coffee, Doc Smokehouse, and Forward Theater Company. Our media partners are the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison.com, WKOW Channel 27, and Hinckley Productions. Again, we thank you for your support and for making Idea Fest 2021 a huge success.